Identity needs enemies. On the 2025 Munich Security Conference, in brief, most writing on a conference like Munich stays inside familiar frames. Realism vs idealism, hawks vs doves, which policy is wiser? This video doesn't. It never asks whether NATO's strategy is correct or which side has better facts. It looks past the political register entirely at the psychological structure that produces political certainty in the first place. The same structure operating in nations as in ordinary people, securing identity not through territory or strategy, but through opposition. At the Munich Security Conference, Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger thinks that an adequate response to a threat from civilizational Eurasia is a response of self-assertion, pride, ambition, and vision. I think this is a terrible misreading of effectiveness, human nature, and reality. It is important to see that within this mode of thinking, the conflict is not merely territorial or strategic. What is actually driving it is people and nations defining who they are by opposing an enemy. Opposition itself is how the sense of identity is secured. This poses a great danger because the outcome of the war becomes tied to how they feel about themselves. This is what gives conflict psychological importance beyond practical concerns. Victory becomes emotional confirmation. Defeat becomes humiliation. And the emotional residue continues long after the war itself has ended. Pride, self-assertion, and ambitions are institutionalized but never cease to be human. Governments, alliances, and ideologies do not create these tendencies from nothing. They organize and magnify what already exists within people themselves. This is why conflict persists even when its outward forms change. The banners, systems, and historical circumstances may differ, but the underlying movement of identity, seeking psychological security through comparison, dominance, and opposition remains fundamentally the same. Self-assertion, pride, ambition are not fixed traits. Reaching for them at times of urgency, as if they are the most important inherent drives, proves that our self-perception is conditioned. Much of what is called human nature is conditioned continuity. Culture projects its own structures and then mistakes them for inevitabilities. Pride depends upon comparison and recognition. Without opposition or hierarchy, it loses much of its meaning. For this reason, identities organized through pride remain highly sensitive to threat humiliation, and competition. What appears outwardly as confidence often contains an underlying fear of diminishment. Self-assertion, pride, and ambition appear natural because they are normalized psychologically and historically. Seeing conditioning clearly dissolves the illusion that these tendencies are intrinsic realities. Reality is not a metaphysical realm, but direct perception unfiltered by conditioning. Wars may alter borders, systems, and balances of power, but they do not end the psychological movement that continually recreates conflict. What transforms conflict is not the victory of one conditioned structure over another, but the direct perception of the conditioning itself. There is something deeply unsettling about the conditioned human mind. Identity exists through continuity. Continuity is strengthened through contrast, just like in a painting. Contrast intensifies through resistance. Resistance creates enemies. Enemies sustain psychological coherence. Now, this is what's unsettling about the present human mind. Wars and large-scale migration are obviously different phenomena, materially, historically, and morally. But psychologically, they can activate similar mechanisms within societies. Both confront populations with uncertainty, difference, instability, and the fear of losing continuity. Under such conditions, identity intensifies. The issue is not war itself or immigration itself in isolation, but the inward movement that turns difference or diversity into opposition and uncertainty into antagonism. Security then becomes increasingly tied to identity preservation rather than direct perception and intelligent relationship. That is why societies organized heavily around identity tend toward polarization regardless of the specific trigger. The object changes, military enemies, immigrants, ideologies, religions, political fractions, but the underlying structure remains fundamentally the same. Without tension, the identity structure weakens. That is why many movements unconsciously require enemies, even after achieving their stated goals. If the enemy disappears, the movement risks psychological dissolution. None of this is consciously manufactured. This is not the battle of good against evil. It's just ordinary psychological mechanisms moving through conflict, whether it's individual, collective, or institutional. Russian accusations are answered primarily with counter accusations. The structure itself is never questioned. One side accuses, the other responds with mirrored accusations, and each interprets itself as reacting defensively. Even if many of the claims are factually correct, facts themselves do not end conflict when they are organized through identity. What matters psychologically is not merely whether something is true, but how truth is being used. Facts become instruments for moral positioning, emotional consolidation, and justification. The accumulation of evidence gradually functions less as inquiry and more as preparation for escalation. The burden of guilt is psychologically redistributed before further conflict takes place. After presenting a sequence of accusations against Russia, the speaker asks, "What can be learned from this?" He then diagnoses Russia's behavior as projection. Yet, the possibility of projection within oneself or within one's own alliance is absent from the inquiry. Self-reflection disappears where it becomes most necessary. This is one of the recurring characteristics of identity-centered conflict. Each side becomes highly perceptive of the other's distortions, while remaining comparatively blind to its own. The structure mirrors itself across opposing camps. Accusation and counter-accusation become mutually reinforcing movements sustained through identification. Johann Wadephul declares that the harsh logic of military deterrence is the main strategic imperative of our time. What is striking is not merely the statement itself, but the unexamined assumption beneath it. Conflict is approached almost entirely through pressure, preparedness, strategic positioning, and the management of threats. There is little sense that the structure producing hostility might itself require examination. The possibility that fear, identity, pride, historical resentment, and mutual projection continuously intensify conflict remains largely outside the discussion. The tragedy is that deterrence may sometimes postpone open violence while simultaneously preserving the psychological conditions that make violence perpetual. Each side strengthens itself against the other while reinforcing the very division from which conflict emerges. What is absent is not intelligence or strategic calculation, but deep self-reflection. Without understanding the psychological mechanisms operating within all sides, preparation for peace gradually becomes indistinguishable on preparation for endless conflict. Military deterrence presents itself as defensive, yet psychologically, the structure is not fundamentally different from offensive thinking. Both are organized around anticipation of conflict, preparation against enemies, and a protection of identity through force. The distinction between defensive and offensive postures often becomes fluid. Weapons justified as deterrence can later become instruments of escalation. Alliances formed for protection can gradually intensify confrontation. Fear prepares for attack even while calling itself defense. This does not mean societies should become passive or ignore danger. The point is deeper. As long as the psychological structure of fear, opposition, and identity remains unquestioned, conflict continues reproducing itself regardless of whether actions are described as defensive or offensive. Preparation for war can temporarily prevent war while simultaneously normalizing the conditions that make future war increasingly likely. Not only the perception of present events, but even the recollection of history is shaped through fragmentary processing. Mark Rutte describes the Berlin Wall as a reminder of the force of freedom and the power of unity. Yet, what is called unity here appears to remain the unity of a fragment identifying itself against other fragment, not the ending of division itself. Freedom also becomes identified within the protection of a particular structure, boundary, or civilization. Ideas threatening that structure are interpreted not merely as disagreement, but as threats to freedom itself. In this way, the language of freedom can unconsciously become intertwined with exclusion, opposition, and psychological defense. Rutte then speaks of the dark forces of oppression being on the march again. But oppression is rarely perceived inwardly. Each side tends to experience its own actions as necessary, defensive, justified, or moral, while projecting domination outward onto the other. The desire to preserve one's own truth, identity, or historical position can itself become oppressive when it seeks psychological or material dominance over others. A deeper contradiction remains largely unquestioned. How can there be genuine unity while consciousness remains organized through division? If unity depends upon opposition to enemies, then conflict is already embedded within it. Rutte says, think of the Ukrainians who might go to sleep tonight and not wake up tomorrow. This appeal is immediately followed by justification for more weapons, more production, more deterrence. This is tragic irony. Suffering is invoked to legitimize the very structure that continually reproduces suffering. The speech culminates in the declaration, what is standing between what's happening to them and what could happen to us? Only NATO. This is the myth of the protector, psychologically not entirely different from the individual belief. I must protect myself at all costs. Fear consolidates identity, and identity seeks security through force. Yet the structure seeking protection may itself contribute to the continuation of conflict. A consciousness organized through fear and division can temporarily suppress violence while simultaneously preserving the conditions from which violence repeatedly emerges. Rutte's repeated refrain, now, before it's too late, within 5 years, depends entirely on psychological time. Time not only orders events chronologically, it also extends problems and postpones resolutions. The future is only an idea in the present. A problem rooted in consciousness is not resolved merely through temporal projection. What matters is concrete reality, not projected ideas. Avoidance is the source of deception, a blind spot in perception. This is not a denial of chronological events. It is a denial of psychological becoming. The speech treats tomorrow as a place where safety will finally arrive, if only enough force is accumulated today. The structure seeking security is itself conditioned by fear. Rutte declares, we are on the right side of history. There is nothing more dangerous than certainty. It is a spear aimed inward. Moral certainty eliminates self-questioning. It prevents examination of one's own psychological motives, since whoever stands on the side of righteousness has no need to look further. History is not a moral tribunal. It is a record of conditioned reactions repeating under different names. This becomes especially visible when fear enters political language. We are Russia's next target. Conflict is at our door. The time for action is now. Such statements may or may not contain factual elements, but psychologically they generate urgency, emotional consolidation, and collective identification. Fear narrows perception. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. Complexity collapses into moral binaries. Inquiry gives way to reaction. Under these conditions, emotional mobilization begins to masquerade as realism. The danger is not only military escalation itself, but the gradual normalization of a consciousness structured through permanent anticipation of conflict. The conference will end, the speeches will be archived, and new leaders will repeat the same refrain under different names. What will not have changed is the structure doing the repeating, identity, protecting itself through the shape of an enemy, mistaking its own reflection for the world.